I had been a sergeant for about 6 years before my agency sent me to my very first leadership class. I didn't know what to expect, and honestly, I thought it was going to be a waste of time. I mean, I'd been an informal leader on night shift for years as the old guy in the FTO. When they promoted me to sergeant, they obviously didn't think leadership was important because they didn't bother to send me to any training. So I wasn't very interested. This story could have had a very different ending, but the leadership training they did send me to was put on by Bill Westfall. Bill Westfall is an amazing instructor and one that really lit the fire under me to be an effective leader. Since then, I began reading every leadership book I could get my hands on, from historical works to books by business leaders. I also took as many leadership classes as I could find. A few of them I took on my own dime and my own time. So when I tell you my guest on this episode is one of the very best teachers in leadership, I'm not kidding. It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. Jack Enter has been associated with the field of criminal justice since 1972 when he began his career as a law enforcement officer. Since that time, he's worked as a street police officer, detective, vice narcotics investigator, manager, and as the administrator of a law enforcement agency in the suburbs of Atlanta. Jack obtained his Ph.D. in 1984 and has served as a professor and administrator in the university setting and served as one of the planners of the security component of the 1996 Summer Olympic Games in Atlanta. He has lectured throughout the United States and abroad on leadership as well as profiling interpersonal violence and the future of crime and policing. He has authored 2 books challenging the law enforcement organization and law enforcement leadership in the midst of change. Jack, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me. I'm really excited about this, and I just want to start out by thanking you for your time.
Hey, glad to do it, brother.
I asked you to come on because I read your book, Challenging the Law Enforcement Organization, and it really blew me away because it hit on all these little things that tied ends together that I personally found myself searching for in my leadership journey in law enforcement. That's why I wanted to have you on. But before we get too far into that, could you take a few minutes and tell the audience about your background and how you became an expert in leadership?
Well, I don't know if it's an expert. What's interesting is I've been doing leadership training for 40 years, and then I came in law enforcement 52 years ago. This, in a way, is an accumulation of what people have come up and said, or when I did what we call the climate surveys and agencies and talked over 1,000 people. This is basically, in a way, in the Navy, I was an intelligence officer, which some people consider an oxymoron. But anyway, it's gathering the information. So what I am sharing is, in a way, a synthesis of the common themes I've seen in these last 52 years. And a large part of that was I was thrown into this leadership training role when I was only 33 years old. And so that's what this is going to be about. And what has been interesting is the complaints have not changed since I was leaning up against a patrol car in 1972. And that is what is stunning, that operationally law enforcement does its job very well. But when it comes to people who then, those same people, when they get promoted, they go a little crazy on us. And that's what this, the book is about. And that's what hopefully this will be about, is why do good men and women from the operational environment become ineffective men and women when that memo comes out saying they're promoted. So my background, basically, as I said, I came in 72, ended up getting drafted into the military. I was one of the last draftees under the old draft system. And that's the only thing I ever wanted in my life. 3 years in the Army, came out, went into law enforcement in the metropolitan Atlanta area. And because of the military experience, I had all this GI Bill, and I had no interest whatsoever so much in getting graduate degrees and stuff because I had my bachelor's already, but it was the money, and I was only making around $5,000 a year. So I could get the VA. So I went on and went to graduate school, and left the agencies in 1980 to go out to work on my PhD. And at the end of that program, I got a phone call from Georgia, where I'm from, asking me how much longer I had. And I told them I was working on my dissertation. And the state of Georgia had passed a bill that required all law enforcement managers, supervisors, managers, and executives to get leadership training. And I was asked to come back and be one of the lead instructors in that, which is interesting. Like I said, I'd only been a first line supervisor, and I was 33 years old. And here I'm teaching chiefs and sheriffs and majors and captains. So I did that. Then providentially, I got laid off by the state, and when they had this big downsizing. And again, providentially, a sheriff's office asked me to come in as a captain. They had grown from 53 employees to 307 in 5 years. And they asked me to head up their training. Obviously, it was a big deal with all those brand new people. And again, providentially, it was experience in practicing what I'd been teaching for the previous 6 or 7 years, and got in the middle of all kinds of issues, had to fire a lot of people, including my boss. And then eventually went back into academia after that. And all this time I'm teaching part-time leadership around the country, and then went back into the field, this time with the military. Got recalled to active duty after 9/11 for a year, which is going to be pivotal in when we're going to talk about why managers don't realize that they're failing. And then got off of active duty after 9/11, and retired from the military, and still travel around speaking. And then, like I said, been doing this for a long time, but really have a passion for this, because I've seen on the faces of law enforcement personnel and managers the frustration because of this leadership failure that's very pervasive, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. And got to train the Moscow police. They had the same complaints that we have, and that has included other countries as well. So I wish I was out of a job because all this had gone away, but it has not. And it's still a major issue. And we're promoting so many people right now, and I'm concerned that they're going to make the same mistakes as their predecessors. So that's what this is about.
Well, it's interesting because I do believe we have a severe problem with law enforcement leadership in the United States. And it's interesting that not only do you agree with that, but you say that's pervasive throughout the entire world. You also said something before we started recording that I wanted to come back to, because I thought it was really important. You said that officers are doing the job in spite of their supervision, not because of it. And I wanted you to explain that a little bit.
Yeah, that's very important. And we're going to be talking about what makes people abnormal. And leadership is an abnormal behavior. We do a good job in training young men and women who come into this profession to do the right thing, to not be about themselves, to run to the sound of the gun, to show behaviors and attitudes that are very commendable. And that is a very strong culture. I just want to summarize one of the most powerful statements is when I was interviewing this 1,100 people, there was a young female officer just last year. I asked her, said, what's the best part of this job working here? And she said, obviously the job, she said, it's all my friends hate me because they're jealous of all the cool things I get to do. But then she made a statement. She said, and I have 140 brothers and sisters who think it's their job to take care of me. She said, how do you put a price tag on that? I said, you can't. And here's my point. That's what keeps law enforcement doing its job, not because of the captain is one of the most inspirational managers they've ever come across. they're used to the fact they can't depend on their managers to do what they need to do. So the operational environment keeps each other in the fight and doing what needs to be doing uh, out on the streets. But the stress is when they come inside the building. And even though they will continue to do their job, it is the number one stressor in law enforcement. It's not robberies in progress and all this other stuff. In fact, that's one of the high motivational positives in the job. It is the drama in the workplace that doesn't make any sense and is inconsistent with how we deal with things out on the street. Um, and and it is interesting to watch that. And it, like I said, it's still going on. Every agency is experiencing this, federal, state, and local. And I want to make sure I emphasize this for all of the people listening to this. I suggest you talk to your friends who are not in law enforcement. They will have the same complaints that we have. And the issue is universally, what happens to a good man or woman that is effective operationally, and then they get that memo saying they've been promoted. They change, and they are good people still, but something has happened to them that brings out the worst in them, not the best in them. And that's why, again, this is so important.
I really want to get to that. But before, I want to back up and explain a little bit about that abnormal behavior comment you made, because that was the big thing that stuck with me with your book, was that very simple statement about leadership being abnormal behavior. And I want you to get into some more details about that and explain that for us.
Yeah. You know, law enforcement, one of the things that we give men and women who come into this profession is a dose of reality about human nature. Law enforcement have one of the most accurate views of human nature. It can be a little jaded sometimes, but and psychologists say there's no such thing as a bad person, and law enforcement understands that's not true. This country, and I want to make an interesting point, this country was founded, and one of the reasons it's been so successful for hundreds of years, because it believed that you cannot trust human nature. They were impacted by the Protestant Reformation in Europe. They believed that power corrupts people, and you always have to have somebody that can hold them accountable, which is the whole reason for our three branches of government and the different levels from federal, state, and local. But the point of it is, human nature is naturally, and that's a key word, selfish. And all you have to do is be around a 2-year-old. A friend of mine calls them vipers in diapers. Anybody who's raised children understands that 2-year-olds are tough to be around. Why? Because their life is focused on them. And they scream and yell and bite, because treason is a serious thing for little king and queen. And that's what all infants are. And as Solomon said, train up a child in the way they should go. What he's saying is you have to socialize them. And the number one skill you teach them, that it is not about them, because they come into this world naturally. We didn't have to train them to be selfish. They are naturally me people. It is about them. And basically 3,000 years ago, Solomon said, you have to train them. It's not about them. It's about we and the people around us and the family and our neighbors and everything. And that's what makes it abnormal. And without training, we are naturally consumed with ourselves. My wife summarized why this country's in trouble. And it really is. The amount of suicides and all the stuff that's going on right now. She said, we live in a country where people are very frustrated and angry because people don't love them as much as they love themselves. So basically, and I've gone to third world countries, they are much happier than us because they still train their children to be we people and that it's not about them. Our people in this country, a lot of them have never got the upbringing that you and I had, where our parents took very seriously disobedience and attitude and all that. And they trained us, which is what Solomon was talking about. that it is not about us, it is about those around us. And why leadership is an abnormal behavior is because it is a perfect summary of being a person who doesn't take themselves seriously, who cares about those around them. They lead by example. They care for one of their employees whose wife has cancer and is in chemotherapy. It is not directed towards them as individuals, but the people around them. And here's the point: that's not natural behavior. Natural behavior is, I don't care about anybody but me. You get very frustrated when things don't go your way, which is a perfect, like I said, 2-year-old or 3-year-old. And unfortunately, this is now the American culture. And when I go overseas, people always ask me why. So people pull guns on the McDonald's clerks because the fries are cold. And that is beyond their imagination. But I tell them, I said, well, I live in a nation of kings and queens where people are consumed with themselves. And what we're seeing in this country, not to get off on a tangent, is basically what happens when we don't follow what Solomon said. Your job is to raise your children to not be focused on themselves, to care for people around them, to watch what they say, watch their attitude. And that's why but here's my point: that's normal behavior. And that's why every society throughout history had to what we call socialize its children into adults. And what we're seeing in leadership is the purest form of we behavior, that these are people who are more focused with paying attention to those around them. It doesn't mean they hate themselves. It is that they're not special, that they serve other people, they have attitudes and behaviors that back that up, that they care for people. And that's why when you talk about leadership, what you're talking about is a person who's been trained to be different. And if you don't train people to be different, they will naturally be a me person, all about themselves. And I want to warn people that with this, it is always there, that natural bent towards just thinking about ourselves. And it is always there, and you must always maintain, no, better yet, you must have those around you maintain that we perspective, that it is not about me, and accountability and all those other things. And if we ever back off of making people abnormal, and you're going to see that theme for the whole way, they will naturally go back to being more focused about themselves, be driven by the opinions of people and how they like them or don't like them. And that's why this is so important. And leadership is a beautiful summary of somebody who is now abnormal to the point that they have been trained so completely that they are willing to sacrifice their lives for people around them, which we see not just in law enforcement, but in the military, and on and on and on. And that's why it's an abnormal behavior. And we have to train people to be like that. And without the training, they are not going to do that. And we're going to see that that's the difference between the operational level and the management level.
That so resonated with me when I read that, and it did again as you explained it. The only question I have then is, where do our informal leaders come from? How did they learn to lead? Those officers that are leading their peer groups that never had any training, nobody ever spent time with them, yet they somehow rise to that occasion and do the things they need to do to lead. Where do they come from?
Well, again, they were trained, and it's interesting. The word training means to transform. Education is a informational based system. It tells us knowledge. Training, in its classic tell, see, do method, actually changes people. And I want to address a debate that's been going on for years, and it is, are leaders born or made? I think because leadership is so abnormal, people go, well, they're special people. You know, they came into this world just special. No, no. They came in this world as normal human beings, and they were transformed by parents, a gunny sergeant in the Marine Corps, or academy instructors in law enforcement and FTOs, and men and women around them in the operational environment who care enough about them to say, you need to back away. You're taking this too personal. And so we train people through modeling. And those people have had, and that's what I'm saying, that's one of the things we offer young men and women. My grandson asked me, why would he want to be a police officer? And I said, if you became a police officer, even if you only did it for 4 years, you would be so much more skilled in the two essential skills, which is character, which is this whole we thing, and your ability to communicate with people in a variety of situations, which most of your peers, I would say 90% of your peers that you went through high school with, when you meet them 5 years later, they are totally different from you. And again, it's the training thing. They were trained. Think about, and I ask men and women in my classes, think about the instructors that you had in your life, whether it was your parents or your grandparents, which I hear often, but also that coach and that teacher that you had in school, as well as in law enforcement. And I know that you're involved in the FTO system, but in the academy, we have these instructors who do a lot of the educational stuff, but the FTOs take us and say, here's how we're going to apply this out on the streets in practical ways. And they do that tell, see, do. They make them take more and more responsibility. They correct it, which we're going to see is very important because no one does it perfectly. And we have all seen a young man or woman from when they first came in to 10 years later, nothing phases them. They're very calm and skilled and equipped with a lot of tools in dealing with human behavior and those around them. And so the point is, they were not born that way, they were made that way. And the military has transformed more people throughout history than almost any other institution. And they don't care what your background is. They have taken young men and women. And I remember when I went through basic training in the Army, we had 40 or 50 people in my unit, and none of us knew each other. We all came from various backgrounds. We had people that grew up in the inner city. We had people who were from affluent families. I remember one guy in my unit his dad was a doctor, but in 7 weeks, through training and modeling and accountability, we were different people at the end. And that's what training does. And if you ever look at effective men and women, if you sit down with them and ask them, who are the biggest influences in your life? Because modeling, watching it being done is the most powerful form of training. I have a PhD, and I tell people, I remember and practice very little what I learned in the classroom because it is a tell and information. What I learned was watching effective men and women doing it, making me doing it, and I copy them, and they help massage my ineffectiveness and teach me to do it better. And when you, in the operational environment, you will see that most cops are effective. When I ask in a class, what percentage of operational personnel will do their job, not without a hiccup? We could all be stupid. The answer I consistently get in 25 years of asking that question is 90%. And what's interesting, and I don't need to end there, but if you ask them what percentage of their managers, who were these same people operationally, practice leadership and care for their people and communicate on a regular basis, make decisions, their answers are in the 10 or 20% level. So you have a complete reversal. Why? Because of the training.
And that's something I definitely want to get into right now
Yeah.
is that, leadership and leadership positions are obviously two different things. And, getting those formal leadership positions as you get promoted in public safety, in my experience, you never get trained before you get the position. And sometimes you don't even get trained after you've gotten the position. Why is that? And I would say that that's a big part of our problem, is that your supervisors, they were never trained.
Absolutely. Well, let me rephrase what you just said. They were trained, but they were trained by ineffective managers to be what? Ineffective. See, again, I'm going to keep pushing this. The most powerful form of training is watching it being done. And even if we disagree with it, it influences us. And our jails and prisons are full of young men and women and older men and women who grew up around people who were toxic, who were, addictive and all that. And guess what they became? They became those same people. And modeling is so powerful that what we're seeing operationally is we are being trained operationally. But when we look at our managers, as we just discussed, we have to do our job in spite of them. And so we all complain about them, and this is so important. And we say, we'll never be like I will never be like my sergeant. I will always communicate with people. I'll always deal with problems. But then when they get promoted, there's a problem. They don't know what this looks like in real life, not some intellectual concept. They don't know, what do you say to one of your employees? Why they don't know that's why they don't have spontaneous contacts with most, and we're going to talk about communication. That's why they don't know how to just talk to somebody leaning up against a patrol car as you wait for a wrecker at this accident, because no one talked to them that was a sergeant, a lieutenant. Their operational people did this, but their managers are such poor role models that we have been terribly impacted by our predecessors that were sergeants, lieutenants, captains. And again, we all know that expression, you may cuss your daddy, but you're a lot like him. And that's what's happened in law enforcement. We have an amazing legacy operationally, but our management and leadership legacy is terrible and ineffective. And here's the formula I always tell people: ineffective managers create what for the future? And the answer is ineffective managers. And so the issue is why, and I need to address the whole, do we prepare supervisors? But the point of it is why training is so critical is because they've been trained by ineffective managers and they don't know what to do instead. And as a result of that, they come into this new position, and don't miss this. They come into this new position from an operational position where they were at the top of their game. They had all these men and women around them doing the right thing and helping them when there's a difficult case. We always had backup operationally. We always had people would show up when we had a complicated issue or a dangerous call. And then they get promoted and they get thrown into an office and no one comes and says, hey, let me help you with this. And they don't know what to do because they were not equipped by their previous supervisor managers, and they're not going to be reinforced by their current peers, which are sergeants, lieutenants, and captains, who are ineffective. And so that's why, and let me address this whole thing on training. I asked every class, I said, how much training is required, academy, FTO, et cetera, before you can become operational law enforcement in your state? And the answers generally run, just for brevity's sake, about 6 months. And they're very proud of that, and they should be. Then I asked them, I said, and when those same men and women get promoted, how much training do they get into this new role? And they all start laughing. And their answers are generally none. And if they do get training, please don't miss this. It's not training. It's an educational program sitting in a classroom talking about, discipline from a theoretical standpoint and the 3 types of communication. And that's why leadership training somebody said, "What? You've been doing leadership training for 40 years. Do you help anybody?" And I started laughing and said, "No." And they said, "I'm serious." And I said, "Well, I'm serious because you can't overcome ineffective modeling by sitting in a classroom talking about concepts that are true, but what they've seen modeled in the agency is not that." And it's hard to transfer the skills we practice in leadership operationally. And this is very important. There is leadership in law enforcement, but it's at the operational level. We practice two major and important leadership skills out on the streets and in the jails where we work. That is, we communicate with a variety of people effectively. We can talk to a mentally disturbed person or a person who just lost their son to fentanyl. We communicate, we're proactive, we talk to people on the streets. And number two, we make a decision. We are decisive in dealing with an issue out on the streets. We don't just leave the call. We address it and resolve it as best we can. It's interesting that those same two leadership skills at the management level, for the last 25 years, I've asked people, what is the most common complaint you have against your managers? Number one is they will not deal with an issue. Everybody knows this is a problem employee and no one has addressed them. Number two is my supervisor manager never talks to me unless I'm in trouble, they need a favor, or I'm their buddy. So the same leadership skills we had operationally, we don't transfer those over into the management culture because it's a hostile environment against leadership. You're surrounded by men and women who don't lead, and if you try to lead, they get mad at you. And so it's interesting, and that's why leadership training is so important, but it's got to be training. And I think the best training program has to be replicating basically what we did in the FTO program, where we take young sergeants and even lieutenants and captains. I know of an agency that has mentor sergeants, mentor lieutenants, and mentor captains. And the mentor captains are taught PowerPoint because they've got to do presentations in front of city council. But we take good, effective people in the management level, and we train all of our brand new, like I said, supervisors and managers. And almost no agency has that program. And instead, we throw them into an office, asking them to do a totally different thing in the environment where there's going to be resistance against what they're trying to do. And these people in the building are not strangers. They're people that if you say something to them they don't want to hear, they have a long memory. The drunks on the street, the battering husband, you don't care what they think about you. And that's why we are courageous and speak the truth to them. But inside the building, the fear of man, which is what Solomon called the fear of wanting to be liked, is very powerful, and it snares these people, which Solomon said it would, that you don't want to do your job. And that's why they don't communicate and they don't make decisions.
I think I got whiplash over that last section, nodding my head up and down.
Yeah, you can tell I haven't spoken this week. It's like I said, it's a passion because I've seen the damage it's done to good men and women who are just tired of the drama. And that's a good description. You're just tired of the drama in the building.
You know, you have a story in your book that I really enjoyed because I found it to be accurate to my own experiences as well. When you were talking about teaching some supervisors, and they were supervisors and afterwards they were saying that they agreed completely with everything you said, and you were like, but they were the ineffective supervisors. Why do supervisors fail to see their own leadership problems? Is it because of this human interaction and kind of modeling your peers that are doing it badly?
I'm glad you mentioned that story. I just wrote out an article on why leadership training fails. And that story was a pivotal story for me. Basically, I was in my first year, again, I was 33 years old, of teaching supervisors, managers, and executives. And I'd taught supervisors, but when the first management class I did, I walked in the room, I put my stuff on the podium, and I heard, Jack, from the back of the room. The worst captain and the two worst lieutenants I ever worked for, they were legends in the police department. Everybody hated working for them. They were the most ineffective managers in the department. And I was in such shock that I literally kind of said, wave back at him. I walked out of the room and the course coordinator looked at me and said, "Are you okay?" I said, "No." I said, "The three worst managers I ever worked for are sitting in the room and this class is on leadership." And he said, "So what's the issue?" I said, "Half of my illustrations are in the room. These are the people that I use illustrations for." And he said, they're not going to know you're talking about them. I said, "Well, I'm going to cut out half of them anyway." I said, "Because they're going to know I'm talking about them. And plus on top of that," and this is important, I said, "they're going to debate me about caring for your people and communication's important and all this other stuff because they apparently, disagreed with that because they never did it." And it was one of the best educations I ever had. In the next 8 hours, non-verbally, they loved the program. They were nodding, affirming me as I spoke, and I'm going, "What in the heck is going on?" Then verbally, they came up to me at the break and said, "This is great stuff. I agree with it." But then they said something very important. They said, "I wish a lot of the sergeants and lieutenants and captains had to go through this because," notice the pronoun, "they are screwing this up."
Right.
Not one of them took ownership. And please, this is one of the most important lessons I learned. For the next 20 or 30 years, non-verbally, everybody loves leadership training, which doesn't make a bit of sense. When they come in the classroom, they love being there. They laugh at all my stories. Yet statistically, 90% of them are failing. Why are they so happy to be there? Because this is not about them. This is about those people back at the agency. And this is reinforced in the 1,000 or so comments I've had on the breaks in class. They consistently come up and say, "Hey, Jack, I appreciate what you're saying today. I 100% agree." And the supervisors always say this: "I wish my chief could have been here. You would have had to talk a lot slower, but I wish he was here." And then when I speak to the chiefs and the sheriffs, they go, "Man, I wish the first line supervisors had to go to this training." What was the common thing I learned? No one saw themselves as needing the training because they are self-deceived. But why are they self-deceived? And this is the key issue. Because unlike operationally, when we told each other the truth, we were our brothers and sisters' keeper. When you become a supervisor, everybody shuts up. And when you're stupid, no one's going to say that. So we live delusionally. And because we don't care enough about our managers and supervisors to walk up to them and say, "Sergeant, if I didn't care for you, I wouldn't say this, but this is a bad decision and you're taking this personal." And because we don't say that, ignorance is bliss, and supervisors and managers live in a delusional view that I'm doing fine. If no one complains about them, then they think they're doing fine. And the story I always tell about that is when I was brought into that agency as a captain, within 2 weeks, I was told about a lieutenant who pulled a knife. When I say pulled a knife, he took out a small penknife and cleaned his fingernails in a female sergeant's face. He got up in her face saying, "I don't like women. I don't like women cops. And hell, if a woman's going to tell a man what to do." He got in her face. By the way, you can't have an edged weapon in the jail, but obviously that didn't bother him. When I went after him, I had several people come to my office and said, "He's always like this. He hates women. You can't leave inmates unsupervised around him because he will push them up against the wall. He'll just pinch them. He'll make fun of them. He is a bully." And I've asked this question in all 50 states. And I asked this question: what did I find when I pulled his personnel file? Everybody knows the answer to that question. And you know the answer to that question. I found nothing. I found no documentation. And all of us remember the principle: if it ain't in writing, it didn't happen. And this lieutenant was actually shocked when I told him he was being terminated. And he asked, "What did I do wrong?" But, and the reason he was delusional is because he had been a sergeant and lieutenant and no one confronted him. No one above him disciplined him for that. And as long as we are not held accountable, we go back to me. We think we're doing fine. We live in a delusion that we're doing fine when everybody hates you and everybody doesn't trust you. And that's why managers fail, because they lost the accountability we had operationally. Operationally, I always had more experienced people around me who would say, hey, you need to back off on this. You're taking this too personal. This guy has some severe mental health issues. It's obvious. And there's two people in life you don't want to fight, mentally disturbed people or both of them, because this guy will pick one of us up and beat the rest of us with him. Stand down. They told me when I was stupid. When you get promoted, no one tells you you're stupid, which makes us more stupid.
Communication, which we've already brought up, and this clearly is a part of that, communication and documentation, that is typically cited as the main reasons for organizational failure, not just in law enforcement, but pretty much in every organization. And it's always such a challenge for leaders. Why do we stop communicating? We do a good job at the operations level, and then all of a sudden we stop communicating. Why?
Absolutely. And let me say this, at the end of the day, communication is the number one skill of the leader. Leadership by nature is a relational issue. You trust who you know. You don't trust people you don't know. And I want to always remind cops that we train cops to be suspicious of others. And when your sergeant never talks to you, when your lieutenant never talks to you, you assume it's because they don't care, when they may, but because they never come out and talk to you. When my kids were little, my wife reminded me of a principle: rules without relationships don't work. And for leadership, it is the critical skill. And yet why we don't do it is for several reasons. One, we don't have a plan. The most worthless statement to say is, yeah, sometime this week I need to talk to people. No, what you have, and the PowerPoint slide I've used for 20-something years, is of a sergeant in Wisconsin. He made a list of every man and woman under his command. I think there were 12. He wrote them in a vertical list, handwritten. And when I was in his office, I noticed 3 of them had a line drawn through them. And I said, what is this list? He said, these are the men and women in the unit. And I said, so why do you write a list? He said, this is a to-do list. I have to this week talk to every man and woman on that list, or I'm not doing my job. And he said, I've got to talk to them. And those 3 I got to talk to so far. And this is, I think, the most important thing about communication. The number one defense when people tell me about communication, they say, I don't have time to do that. I said, how much time do you spend with them? He said, it's about 5 to 10 minutes per person. I said, so if my math is correct, you're only talking about an hour to 2 hours in the entire week you spend time talking with people. He goes, yeah. And I said, so what do you talk to them about? I just check and see how they're doing. I know one of them has a mother with Alzheimer's, and I just check and see how his mom's doing. The other one's getting prepared for the sergeant's exam. I ask them how that's going. I ask them about when they're finishing their graduate degree they've been working on for the last 4 years. I just sit and talk to them for a minute. And I said, why do you do that? He said, because that's my job. I get to see them as people, not people on an org chart. He was the most effective leader in that organization. Everybody came up to me later and said, everybody loves working for him. In 2 hours a week, and what's more important, not only does he convince them that he cares, but he's reminded of the mission again and the people under him. And you remember the young officer said, I have 140 brothers and sisters. When we get promoted, those same men and women are our brothers and sisters still. It doesn't matter if you're a lieutenant or a captain or whatever. And every time, and I want to this has got to be emphasized, every time you don't want to do it, but you do it anyway, you're glad you did it. And I know a man that talked to 300 people in a year. I know another person, and this is to me stunning. He talks to 450 people a month. He goes to roll calls on every division, every precinct and shift. And he shows up early to talk to the people going on duty. And then he hangs out there. And you got to remember now, this could be 11 o'clock at night, to talk to the people coming off duty, to just see how everybody's doing. And I asked him, I said, that's an amazing schedule. And he goes, yeah. And, but he said, I never want to do it, but after I do it, I'm so thankful. I said, why? He said, because I get to see my people, and they're not my people. They're my brothers and sisters. He said, my wife said my attitude has dramatically changed since I started doing this. He said, I am so blessed to have these people working for me. So you not only do it for them, you do it for yourself. It is interesting. One of the most common complaints we hear against our managers, and I've heard this verbatim for the last 25 years or 40 years, they forget where they come from. The thing that binds us is the mission. And when we communicate, not only are we communicating, we're going back to the mission and the men and women who do it. And this is why we love this job so much operationally. And let me say this, and this is why we hate our job as managers, because we're stuck in the office dealing with politics, the problem employee, and it sucks the energy out of us. And when we communicate, it's the best thing for us as well. And it builds trust both ways. They trust us and we trust them. And yeah, this is the number one skill of the leader. And if you don't do it, you will fail dramatically, just like most of the managers are failing, because they don't communicate except with their buddies, except when there's a problem, and except when they need a favor. And that's an agenda, me-driven contact, not a we contact.
Jack, this has been absolutely amazing. I can't thank you enough for this insight. As we wrap this up, do you have any last statements or last things you want to make sure that you emphasize for our listeners?
Yeah. I was asked, so what do we do to turn this around? I keep mentioning the military, and I know they're not perfect, but I was doing a presentation up in a state where the State Bureau of Investigation, I was doing the leadership presentation, and the director came up to me afterwards and said, I'm really enjoying what you have to say. Listen to what he said. He said, I've been here for a year, and I am shocked at the ineffectiveness of supervisor managers. He said, they are terrible compared to what I used to be around. I said, what did you used to be around? He said, I retired out of the military. I was a colonel in special ops and Green Berets and stuff like that. And I said, how did y'all do it better? He said, we train every man and woman that works in an organization or a battalion or a company to practice respectful insubordination. I said, what is that? He said, if we're being stupid, say something. Do it respectfully, but you've got to say something. I said, so what's the purpose of that? He said, to keep us from being stupid. When we have all of these eyes around us, seeing when we're making a mistake and they correct us, we rarely make mistakes. He said, think about that if I had 200 people in my battalion, I had 200 people who thought it was their job to tell me the truth. So I was always brought back to reality that it's not about me. It's always going to be an accountability. And it's always going to be that we do it as a group. And that's what's important. Not only do they confront us when we're stupid, they encourage us when we need courage. And I want to say this, as a sergeant, lieutenant, and captain, you need courage. And in the courage of the group who are making you get in the fight and stay in the fight and deal with the problem employee, you will be amazing. I want to give you a quote from Alexander the Great. He said, "I would rather have a herd of sheep led by a lion than a herd of lions led by a sheep." Courage is a product of, it makes us courageous. And you can't do this on your own. Here's the message I'm trying to hit you with at the end here. In the company of men and women who care enough about me to tell me the truth and encourage me when I'm getting hit for doing the right thing, I will be amazing. You can't do this alone. That is what made us so strong operationally. I always had somebody on the way to help me at a bad call. Managers don't have that. You need to have regularly, every week, men and women in your life that you vet decisions through, you ask for their input on, but most importantly, you say, I need you to tell me the truth when I'm being stupid. And you can watch their faces. They'll say, but you're my sergeant, you're my captain, you're my whatever. Say, and if you don't say something, I'm going to continue to be stupid, and I need you to help me. And I think in all the leaders I've ever met, they have men and women in their lives, a multitude of them. You can't ask one person. That's too much of a burden on them. Get that multitude of people in your life who you vet things through, you ask and solicit for feedback so they don't have to say it when you're being stupid, because you're asking them, is this a stupid decision? And all of you, everybody listening to this has known, if you ask somebody to read a memo before you send it out, they're going to find mistakes that you never saw. And we are naturally self-deceived. We are blind to how we're actually doing unless we have men and women in our lives who go, that's a really stupid thing, what you just did. And it's interesting. Solomon has this quote, and it's one of my favorite ones. Faithful are wounds of a friend. He said, a real friend is someone who hurts you when you need it. Managers don't have that. Operationally, we did. That's why we were awesome operationally. And that's why we're not so awesome when we become managers, because we lose accountability. And as soon as we lose accountability, we're going to become ineffective. And we're going to be fearful and lack courage. Fear dominates the management culture in law enforcement. Here's a warrior class culture that is afraid to make a decision and confront problem employees. It's amazing to watch. And the solution to that is don't do it by yourself. Have a squad or team of men and women in your life that you do leadership with them. And also you're training them for the future to be a sergeant, lieutenant, and a captain.
Jack, this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for your time. This has been extremely helpful. And that's the story we have to tell. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.